3 days after burying her husband, Sarah Whitfield discovered the locks on her own front door had been changed. But the house was not the only thing his family was trying to take from her. Somewhere inside the walls of the business she and her husband had spent 17 years building, a secret was waiting, one that would turn the very people who tried to destroy her into the reason everything they had would eventually fall apart. Sarah stood on that porch for almost 10 minutes, key in hand, refusing to believe what her own fingers were telling her. She tried the lock again. Nothing. She knocked softly at first, then harder, until her knuckles ached against the wood of a door she had walked through every single day for 17 years. No one answered, and somewhere inside that house, someone was watching her through the window, letting her stand there in the cold. His name was Michael, Sarah's husband, a man who had died 4 days earlier suddenly without warning in the very company he built with his own hands. What his family did not know, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that Michael had already seen this exact moment coming. He had prepared for it, quietly, carefully, months before his heart ever stopped beating. Michael Whitfield married Sarah when she was 26, with nothing but a used car, a small apartment, and a stubborn belief that two people who loved each other could build something out of almost nothing. 17 years later, that belief had turned into a real company, a real home, and a real life. And now, 4 days after his funeral, his own family was standing inside her locked house, going through her life like it had never belonged to her at all. But the locked door was nothing compared to what came next. Michael did not grow up the way Sarah did. He grew up in a large house on the edge of town, the kind of house other families pointed at when they drove past. His father had built a successful construction business decades earlier, and by the time Michael was a teenager, the Whitfield name meant contracts, reputation, and money that moved quietly behind closed doors. It also meant control. Michael's mother, Margaret, ran that house the way she ran everything else in her life. Every decision passed through her first: what her children studied, who they dated, which friendships were allowed to survive. His older brother Robert learned early that the easiest way to survive their mother was to agree with her. His younger sister Claire learned the opposite lesson, that survival meant disappearing quietly into the background of every family decision. Michael was the only one who ever tried to leave. At 23, he walked away from the family business against everything his mother wanted, and took a job on a small construction crew across town under a shortened version of his own name, just so no one on the site would connect him back to the Whitfield family. That is where he met Sarah. She noticed him before he noticed her, mostly because he was always the first one on site and the last one to leave, and because he was the only person on that crew who ever thanked her for keeping the schedule straight. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony his mother did not attend. Margaret sent a card instead, short, formal, not one warm word inside it. Sarah kept that card in a drawer for years, a quiet reminder of exactly where she stood with that family from the very beginning. For a long time, that distance seemed to protect them. Michael and Sarah spent their first years of marriage in a rented apartment above a hardware store, saving every spare dollar toward a business neither of them could yet afford. Michael worked construction by day and studied contracts by lamplight at night. Sarah kept a second job doing bookkeeping for a dentist's office, learning the exact skills that would later keep their own company alive. Neither of them spoke much about the Whitfield family during those years. It was easier, Sarah would later say, to build a future with a man who felt like he belonged only to her. By their 5th year of marriage, they had saved enough to open a small office with a single truck and 3 employees. By their 10th, that company had 11 employees and a name people in town trusted. Sarah handled every dollar that moved through it. Michael made sure every job was done the way his own father never quite managed to teach him, with care and without cutting corners. It was, in every sense that mattered, entirely theirs. There were harder years too, the kind most people never see in a story like this one. A winter when 3 clients canceled projects in the same month, and Sarah quietly sold a ring her own grandmother had left her, just to cover payroll without telling Michael where the money had come from. A summer when Michael broke 2 fingers on a job site and kept working anyway, because the company could not yet afford to lose him for 6 weeks. They never once considered calling the Whitfield family for help during those years. It never occurred to either of them that help was something that family offered without a price attached. Then Michael's father died, and everything started to change. With her husband gone, Margaret's grip on the family only tightened, and Robert, always desperate for her approval, inherited the family construction business their father had spent a lifetime building. Running a company, though, is nothing like inheriting one, and within a few years, cracks that had been carefully hidden from everyone outside the family began forming underneath the surface. Sarah remembers the exact evening it started, because Michael had come home unusually quiet, and when she asked what was wrong, he told her his mother had called for the first time in almost 11 years. He said it the way a person mentions the weather changing, careful not to let too much hope show through. But Sarah heard it anyway, underneath everything he was not saying. That is when Margaret started calling Michael again. Phone calls that had never come before started arriving weekly. Invitations to dinners that had not existed in over a decade suddenly appeared. Margaret called it reconciliation, a mother finally softening with age. Sarah was wary from the very first phone call. Michael, though, wanted more than almost anything to believe his mother had changed. He had no idea what that phone call would eventually cost him. So Michael began quietly helping with the family business, nights and weekends, unpaid, simply trying to keep his brother afloat, and more than that, trying to finally earn a place in a family that had let him walk out the door years earlier without a single word to stop him. It was during one of those late nights, alone with his brother's ledgers, that Michael found the first number that did not add up. At first he assumed it was carelessness, then he found a second number, then a third, and slowly Michael Whitfield realized he was not looking at sloppy bookkeeping at all. He was looking at a second set of books entirely, one that did not match anything filed with the state. Client deposits that never reached the real accounts, payments recorded twice, money leaving the business and disappearing somewhere Michael could not yet trace. He went to his mother first, carefully, the way you approach someone you love but no longer fully trust. Margaret did not deny a single number. She looked at her son and said, quietly, that everything tied to this family would eventually belong to the family, all of it, and that some things were simply not his concern. Michael asked her, almost without thinking, what exactly she meant by all of it. Margaret did not answer that question. She only smiled, the way she always did when a conversation was over whether the other person agreed or not. That smile would haunt Michael for months, because he understood in that single moment that his mother was not only talking about the business his father built, she was talking about something else, something that had never belonged to her in the first place. Michael did not tell Sarah what he had found. Instead, he did something quieter, something that, at the time, might have looked to anyone else like an overreaction. He started meeting privately with an attorney 2 towns away, someone with no connection whatsoever to the Whitfield name. He told Sarah only that he was updating some paperwork, just to be careful. She did not push for more. In a marriage built on 17 years of trust, there was no reason to. What Michael actually did in that attorney's office, and exactly what he chose to protect, is something Sarah would not understand for a very long time. It is something we are going to come back to later, because it becomes the single most important detail in everything that happens in this story. For now, remember only this: Michael was not simply preparing paperwork. He was preparing for betrayal. In the weeks after those meetings, people who knew Michael noticed small changes in him that none of them could quite explain at the time. He started arriving at work earlier than usual, even for him. He began backing up company files onto a drive he kept at home. He asked Sarah, almost casually one evening over dinner, whether she remembered the name of the bank where they had opened their very first business account together, all those years ago above the hardware store. Sarah laughed and asked why on earth that mattered. Michael only shrugged and said he liked remembering where things started. She would think about that conversation constantly in the months that followed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 4 months after those private meetings, Michael collapsed at his own company and did not survive the day. He was 49 years old. No warning, no history of heart trouble, just an ordinary Tuesday morning that ended everything. Sarah got the call at 11:42. By the time she reached the hospital, he was already gone. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a hallway when the worst thing you can imagine has already happened. Sarah remembers almost nothing from those first hours except that silence, and the sound of her own shoes on the tile floor, impossibly loud. What she does remember, clearly even now, is that Margaret was already at that hospital. Not beside her son's body. In the hallway, on the phone, speaking low enough that Sarah could not make out a single word. In her grief, Sarah did not think to ask who her mother-in-law was calling. She would understand exactly what that phone call meant only weeks later. Because while Sarah spent the following days choosing flowers and writing an obituary for a man who deserved far more words than she had strength to write, Margaret, Robert, and quiet, soft-spoken Claire were already making plans of their own. The funeral looked from a distance exactly the way a funeral should. Flowers, a long line of condolences, Margaret in black, dabbing carefully at her eyes for every relative who raised a phone to take a photograph. But not one member of Michael's family asked Sarah how she was holding up. Not one offered to help her sort through his things. Instead, within 72 hours, Sarah walked into her own company and found Robert going through the file cabinets in the back office. She asked him what he was doing. His answer came fast, almost rehearsed. He said he was simply making sure everything was in order for the family. That weekend, the side entrance locks were changed without her knowledge. And that same weekend, the front door of the house she had shared with Michael was changed too, which is exactly where this story began. The following week, a letter arrived from a law firm she had never heard of, representing Margaret Whitfield, informing Sarah that the family intended to formally review the ownership of the company Sarah had believed. Her entire married life belonged only to her and her husband. Sarah read that letter twice, standing in her own kitchen, and felt something inside her go completely cold. It should never have worked. The company had never legally been part of the Whitfield family business, not financially, not on paper, not in any way that would normally survive in front of a judge. But Margaret Whitfield had spent her entire life getting exactly what she wanted through sheer force of will, and grief, she had learned long ago, made people slow to fight back. She had no idea how wrong she was about Sarah. Over the following month, the pressure only grew heavier. Claire began quietly reaching out to longtime employees, hinting that changes were coming, and that loyalty to the family, not to Sarah, would decide who kept their jobs. Robert tried to access the company's bank accounts directly, using an old, expired document Sarah did not even know still existed. And Margaret, always the most careful of the three, began quietly telling mutual friends a very different story. That Sarah had pushed Michael away from his own family, that the business had really been built on Whitfield money from the beginning, that Sarah, in her grief, might not be thinking clearly enough to manage anything on her own. Fake concern, fake tears at the funeral, quiet phone calls to lawyers the moment no one was watching. Margaret was not simply cruel, She was patient, and patient people are far more dangerous than angry ones. One afternoon, Margaret showed up at Sarah's house uninvited, carrying a casserole dish and a soft, sympathetic expression she had clearly practiced in a mirror. She told Sarah she only wanted to help, that grief made people foggy, and that perhaps it would be easier if Robert simply handled the business side of things for a while, just until Sarah felt more like herself again. Sarah thanked her for the casserole and closed the door. She had never trusted a kind word from that family less in her life. Isolate the widow, question whether she is capable, move fast before she has time to get her footing back. It is a pattern estate attorneys see more often than most people realize. What Margaret did not know was that Sarah was about to stop being easy to move. Sarah hired her own attorney, a sharp, unflinching woman named Renata, who had spent her career untangling exactly this kind of family fight, the kind that looks like grief from the outside and is really about money and control wearing grief as a disguise. In their very first meeting, Sarah mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Michael had updated some paperwork a few months before he died. Renata went very still. She asked Sarah one question, just one. Did she know which attorney Michael had used? Sarah remembered a business card tucked into the back of his desk drawer. A small, independent estate firm 2 towns over. The same office he had quietly visited alone 4 months before he died. When Renata called that firm, she learned something even Sarah had never known. A legal structure had been built around the company, something specific, something sealed, something that could not be opened until certain conditions were met. No one, not even Sarah, would learn exactly what Michael had done until this entire fight forced it into the open. For weeks, Sarah lived with that uncertainty, knowing her husband had left something behind meant to protect her, and having no idea how much power it actually held. During that same stretch of weeks, a rumor reached Sarah through a mutual friend that stopped her cold. Someone at a family gathering had mentioned, almost in passing, that Michael had secretly taken out a large personal loan shortly before he died, a loan no one could account for. For 2 sleepless nights, Sarah wondered if the sealed file Renata kept mentioning had nothing to do with protecting her at all, and everything to do with a debt Michael had never told her about. Renata traced the rumor back within a day. There was no loan. It had come from Robert, repeated to a cousin at a dinner Sarah had not attended, the kind of story that spreads faster than any correction ever could. It was the first time Sarah understood just how many small, deniable lies that family was capable of telling at once, each one designed to make her doubt either her husband or herself. While she waited, Renata quietly began her own investigation into the Whitfield family construction company, requesting old permits, old tax filings, anything public that might explain why a business with Robert's reputation was suddenly this desperate to claim a stake in something that had never belonged to it. What she found only deepened the mystery. 2 years of missed tax filings, a supplier lawsuit that had quietly been settled out of court, a pattern of late payments that stretched back further than Robert had ever run the company alone. Something had been wrong in that family business long before Michael ever noticed it. Renata also requested Michael's own company records, simply as a matter of routine, and found exactly what she expected to find. Every dollar accounted for, every contract on file. 17 years of a business run so cleanly that even the most aggressive lawyer on Margaret's side would struggle to argue it had ever belonged to anyone but Sarah and Michael. It was, Renata told Sarah privately, the strongest foundation she had ever seen walking into a fight like this one, and it existed only because Michael had spent nearly 2 decades doing things the right way, long before he ever suspected he would need to prove it. Meanwhile, Margaret's claim kept moving forward, confident, unshaken, certain that a grieving widow would eventually give in the way everyone always had before. 3 weeks later, Margaret's lawyers scheduled a mediation meeting, so sure of their position that they walked in expecting the entire conversation to end in their favor within the hour. Robert and Claire sat on one side of a long conference table. Margaret sat between them, composed, unreadable, exactly as she had been her entire life. Sarah sat across from them, Renata beside her. And it was in that room, under fluorescent lighting no one there would ever forget, that Renata placed a single sealed file on the table. The room went completely silent. Margaret's eyes moved to the file and did not move away from it. Inside was a notarized statement, recorded in Michael's own voice 4 months before his death, and copies of the financial records he had quietly gathered during those long nights reviewing his brother's books. Renata opened to the first page. In it, Michael described exactly what he had found: the second set of books, the missing client deposits, years of company funds diverted away from the family business into accounts that answered to no one but his mother. Margaret's face changed instantly. He had not recorded that statement out of anger. He recorded it because he suspected, even then, that his mother's financial situation was far worse than anyone understood, and that if anything ever happened to him, she would eventually come looking for a way to make up the difference using the one thing she could not otherwise touch: his marriage. Robert stared at his mother like he was seeing her for the very first time. Renata's voice stayed calm. She explained that pursuing this claim any further would mean opening the entire family construction business to full financial discovery that would expose exactly what Michael had found, evidence that, according to his own notes, may have crossed the line from mismanagement into something far more serious. It was not a threat. It was simply the truth, arriving at the exact moment a family had assumed grief would make Sarah too weak to fight back. And then something happened that no one in that room expected. Claire stood up. The quiet one, the one who had spent her entire life staying out of her mother's way. She looked at Margaret and said, quietly, that she had suspected something was wrong with the business for over a year, and that she had stayed silent out of fear, and out of a belief that speaking up would cost her the only family she had left. Margaret told her daughter to sit down. Claire, for the first time in her life, did not. She said that she remembered, clearly, a night almost 2 years earlier when she had walked into her mother's home office to find Margaret transferring money between accounts late at night, and that when she asked about it, Margaret had told her it was simply easier to manage things herself, and that Claire had believed her. Because believing her mother had always been easier than questioning her. She said she had thought about that night constantly since Michael's funeral, and that she was done pretending she had not. Margaret's expression did not change, but something in the room did. For the first time since anyone could remember, she had nothing prepared to say back. It was the first fully honest thing anyone in that family had said out loud in years, and it happened in front of the one person that family had spent months trying to convince was too broken to notice anything at all. Margaret's attorneys withdrew the claim within the week. Outside the conference room, before anyone had reached the parking lot, Robert turned to his mother and asked her, in a voice loud enough for Sarah to still hear through the closing door, whether any of it was true. Margaret did not answer him either. She simply walked to her car, got in, and drove away, leaving her son standing on the curb with a question she would never fully answer for the rest of her life. But that was not the end of this story, not even close. Michael's discovery meant the original Whitfield construction business, the one Robert had inherited, was already insolvent, years of quietly diverted funds having left it unable to reliably cover its own payroll. Within 8 months, that business collapsed into bankruptcy. Robert, who had spent his entire life believing the family name would always catch him if he fell, was left with almost nothing. Margaret, facing mounting personal debt and the very real threat of a fraud investigation, Sarah's attorney had quietly flagged to regulators, was eventually forced to sell the very house Michael had spent his life trying to escape. The same house where a wedding invitation had once gone unanswered. The same table where Margaret had once told her son that some things simply were not his concern. Sarah heard about the sale secondhand from Claire and felt, to her own surprise, no satisfaction in it at all. Only a quiet, tired sense that a chapter neither of them had chosen to be part of had finally closed. The employees who had once been quietly warned by Claire to expect changes stayed exactly where they were, still working for Sarah, still paid on time, still telling her, whenever they had the chance, how much they had liked working for her husband. One of them, a foreman named Daniel who had worked beside Michael for almost a decade, told Sarah something months later that she has never forgotten. He said Michael had pulled him aside not long before he died and told him, almost offhandedly, to always keep his own paperwork organized, no matter who he trusted. At the time, Daniel thought it was just Michael being Michael, careful about everything down to the smallest detail. Looking back, he told Sarah, it sounded like a man quietly warning everyone around him without ever explaining why. You might think that is where this story ends, the truth exposed, the widow victorious, the credits rolling. It is not. Because a few months later, Claire reached out to Sarah directly, not through lawyers, with a handwritten letter apologizing for years of silence and asking carefully if there was any way to build something honest between them going forward. Sarah had every reason to walk away from every Whitfield left standing. Instead, when Claire's own finances collapsed alongside her mother's, Sarah offered her a job inside the very company Claire's family had once tried to take from her. Not out of blind trust, Sarah watched her carefully for a long time first. She gave her small responsibilities before large ones and paid close attention to how Claire handled every one of them. There were moments, especially early on, when Sarah caught herself searching Claire's face for some hint of her mother, some sign that the kindness was another performance waiting to turn. It never came. Slowly, month by month, invoice by invoice, decision by decision, she recognized something in Claire that had never existed anywhere else in that family. The willingness to choose honesty, even after it cost her everything. It took nearly 2 years before Sarah trusted Claire enough to hand her a set of keys to the office, the same kind of gesture that once meant nothing to her and now meant almost everything. As for Margaret and Robert, neither has spoken to Sarah since that conference room. Margaret lives quietly now, 2 hours from the town she once controlled with a single look. Robert works today on someone else's construction crew, the exact kind of job his younger brother once took just to escape the family name. You would think that was the final twist. It was not. Almost a year after the mediation meeting, while cleaning out an old storage unit Michael had rented years earlier and never once mentioned, Sarah found a single sealed envelope taped to the underside of a workbench drawer, addressed to her in his handwriting. Her hands were shaking before she even opened it. Inside was a letter and a small memory card. On it, recorded the same week he visited that attorney 2 towns over, was a video Michael had never told anyone existed. In it, he spoke directly to Sarah calmly, the way he always did, and told her that if she was ever watching this, it meant his family had done exactly what he feared they would, and that everything he had built into that sealed file had been built for one reason only: so that she would never again have to stand outside a locked door wondering if she still belonged inside her own life. Michael's voice on that recording sounded exactly the way it always had, unhurried, steady, the voice of a man reading a grocery list rather than preparing for the end of his own life. He told her which drawer held the original company documents. He told her Renata's firm had already been briefed on everything, months before Sarah ever sat across from her for the first time. And near the very end of the recording, his voice changed, just slightly, and he told her that none of this had ever been about the money, that it had only ever been about making sure she never had to face his family alone, the way he once had to face them alone for most of his life. Sarah watched that video 3 times the night she found it, and has watched it once every year since, on the anniversary of the day she found the locks changed. Every morning, she still unlocks the office with the same keys Michael once carried in his own pocket. The difference now is simple. They are the only keys that still matter. Sarah has said, in the rare moments she has spoken about that year publicly, that she does not tell this story to make anyone hate a mother, or a brother, or even to make anyone admire a sister who eventually found her courage far later than she should have. She tells it because she believes there are women watching this right now who have stood exactly where she once stood on a porch, holding a key that no longer fits, wondering if the people who are supposed to protect them will show up at all. To them, she says only this: sometimes the person protecting you is not in the room anymore. Sometimes they left everything you need long before you ever knew you would need it. So we have to ask you, watching this story tonight, if you were Sarah, would you have forgiven Claire the way she did? Or would you have walked away from that family forever, no matter what she said in that letter? Tell us honestly in the comments below. We read every single one, and if this story kept you watching until the very last second, wait until you hear what happens in the next family we are about to tell you about. Subscribe now so you never miss it, and we will see you in the next story.